Hello and welcome to the New Moon Tarot reading for the new moon that fell on Saturday at 9:28 p.m. UK time, and also accompanied by a solar eclipse in Taurus. So there is a lot going on from an astrology point of view, and it'll be interesting to see what is reflected, mirrored in the tarot for this month. If you're familiar with the reading, you can skip to the first timestamp, which is the first card. Otherwise, for those of you who are new to the reading or just want a little recap of how I read, welcome to those of you who are new to the new moon reading, and it's lovely to have you join us. The way that I read is nearly always tends to be a 3-card reading. There is a set meaning for each of the 3 card positions. So the first card is foundational. It's the foundation card. And that is something that you are coming into the reading with that has already happened in a certain way, because obviously foundation, it's the building blocks of the reading. And that may have happened in the recent past, it may have happened in the distant past, or both. But it is in some way playing a really key role in how it is that you meet card number 2. And card number 2 is the theme or the weather report for this month. The theme is something that is going to impact your life in a large way or a small way, but a significant way, either way. And it is in some way going to define your experience, whether that experience is inner or outer or both. So you've got the second card then, which is the theme card, which has been paved the way for by the foundation card. And then the final card is card number 3, which is the tool or agency card. And this is the card where you are able to interact meaningfully with the theme, so that there is a sense of agency in how it is that you not only experience the theme card and experience things unfolding in your life and in the lives of others around you, but also in a way that you can kind of pin significance into it. So in other words, you're not just merely a helpless, hapless observer of what's unfolding, but rather a participant in what's unfolding to a greater or lesser degree. You may not be able to control what's going on, but you can always control your response to what's going on. And so therefore, the agency card can be an incredibly important card for how it is that you are affected and impacted by the reading and what it is mirroring in the world around you and inside you. I have shuffled the deck. Thankfully, I had a go-ahead, yes, please read card this morning, as opposed to the 3 absolutely no, don't read cards yesterday, because I always draw a card or 2 before I read just to make sure that it's the right time to read. And I put the card back in the deck, so it may come up, it may not. And I've now got the cards face down, 3 cards face down in front of me. And the way that I normally read is that I will read in live time. In other words, I haven't looked at the cards beforehand. I haven't prepared anything that I'm going to say. They are going to be as much of a surprise to me as they are to you. And I'm simply going to work on layering a story up, doing first a brief view of the one card that I turn over, and then more observations, and then obviously as the cards get turned over one by one, the story becomes more complex and there is a clear thread of the direction that the reading wants to take and how it is that you are going to experience it, both again inwardly and outwardly. I always say both inwardly and outwardly. It's one of the phrases I use a lot, simply because I'm very much of the school of thought that what happens outside of us is a reflection of what happens within, or is in some way in response to inward events. How we experience the world outside is how we are inside, and therefore we can interpret the world in very different ways depending on who we are and where we're at in our lives. So whenever you look at a card's significance, if it doesn't actually make sense to you outside, I think that very often when we draw court cards, for example, well, the first thing I think many of us are sort of tempted towards is to view the court card as somebody external to us. But actually, the best way to do it is to look at how the court card is expressing itself through us first, where it is inside and how it's expressing. or how it's not expressing, and where it might be expressed, where it's being suppressed, where it's coming out sideways, all of those things. The court cards, for example, may feel like they're coming at you from the outside and somebody else, but again, it's a mirror for what's going on inside. Whether it's a mirror where you know what's going on, or it's a mirror that's showing you something that you are as yet unfamiliar with. So I'm now going to go on to the first card, which is the foundation card. Remember, this is something that has happened in either the distant or near past, or both. It may be a theme that runs through your life, but it is in some way significant to the events that are going to be unfolding for you over the next 4 weeks particularly, but then beyond as well. So the foundation card is the Tower. Talk about starting off with a bang. The Tower is one of the major arcana cards. And the major arcana cards are primarily associated, in the way that I read anyway, not everyone does, but in the soul's evolution. The evolution of the self with a capital S. Well, not that the self needs to evolve, but our evolution towards a greater and deeper connection with the self. And when we go through the major arcana card by card, we can see that evolution taking place from the very personal cards at the beginning. The Magus, the High Priestess, the Empress, the Emperor, to the very impersonal cards that come towards the end. So you've got, the Moon, the Sun, Judgment, the World. So it goes from a sort of microcosm to a macrocosm. And the Tower, as card number 16, falls towards the end of that evolution. So there is that idea of it's almost a gateway into the macrocosm, because the cards preceding it are really very, they are cards of personal upheaval, or personal reckoning, is another way of seeing it. And upheaval I would use in a very neutral sense, because upheaval can be negative, but it also can be positive. It's just that one way or the other, it disrupts what it is that's the status quo. It is basically calling everything into question. So to give it a little bit of context, we start with, let's say, the Hanged Man at 12. Now, the Hanged Man is that symbolic crucifixion. It's where something happens that is beyond your control, and in some way you are suspended upside down. So in other words, you see things from a totally different viewpoint, but you're also held in place by something. It may be that you have been scapegoated. It may be that things are on hold. It may be that you realize that some of the choices you've made have taken you in completely the opposite direction than you were sort of intending to go. It is the midlife crisis. It is the card of recalibrating, but recalibrating under some considerable discomfort. It may be physical discomfort. I've known people who have dealt with the Hanged Man as an injury that then needs to be tended to, and therefore just almost confines somebody a lot more, so that they have a lot of time to think. And very often people will come out the other side of an injury, for example, with a very different view of life and very different priorities. So that can be part of it. But another part of it can be being scapegoated, for example, or finding out that what you wanted isn't actually what you wanted, and it's got you up shit creek without a paddle. But all of these places are very productive places to be. Now, James Hollis, the Jungian analyst who has brought out some really rather exceptional books, I'm actually reading one of them at the moment, talks about some of these areas, these difficult to endure but very productive places, as swamplands of the soul. And I would say that the Hanged Man is one of those moments. It's where we are having to contend with our unfinished business, because our actions in the outer world have, whether we know it or not, led us up to this point. Our choices have really resulted in us being, suspended upside down. I actually have an article that I wrote several years ago about this, which is on my site, and I will link to it. It's called Suspended Revelation, which is about the Hanged Man. And the reason I'm going on so much about the Hanged Man here when we've got the Tower is because it's about understanding how the Tower has happened. So you get the Hanged Man, and then after the Hanged Man, change is inevitable. Once you have been suspended upside down and you have seen things from a totally different perspective, then it is skin shedding time. It is inevitable in as much as you may be forced through the change, but it also may become an absolute no-brainer for you. That there is no way that you can continue the way that you have before. That reflection that you've had through the Hanged Man means that you now know and understand things that you cannot unknow and you cannot forget, and therefore life will never be the same again. So then you shed a skin and you walk forward. And then you have temperance. And temperance then is the adult response to conflict, internal conflict and external conflict. Let's focus on the internal conflict though. It may feel like a conflict, it may not, but the reason why I use the word conflict is because as we know, when we grow up, things aren't simple anymore. There are no black and white answers. There is no totally right and totally wrong. And very often making choices in our lives, there are no clear options between one choice and the other choice. I think that the childlike part of ourselves wants to have something very clearly said, this is what you need to do, it's very clear, and then this is what you don't need to do because this is wrong, it's bad for you. I know there have been many times in my life where I've wished to go back to a kind of childlike state, even if I didn't have this as an actual child, where I have somebody in charge, whether they are a particular person or an entity inside that says, this, Sarah, is what you need to do. Don't do that, do this. And actually, as we get older, we realize that the choices become more complex and that everything has a price to pay. Giving up one thing means the grieving around that. It may not necessarily have been working for us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the giving up is a simple thing that's easily done. And taking up another thing may also mean compromise. And so really when it comes to the idea of temperance, temperance is about moderation. It's moderating and actually moderating between two different ideas. It is about acknowledging the path not taken, while also choosing the path that opens up for you. It's understanding that these things aren't clear-cut. It's working with limited resources. It is working with inner and outer conflict. It is understanding that sometimes there is no clear resolution to something and that there are seemingly opposing forces that can never be reconciled. And when one steps into temperance in a way that is from the perspective of the self, rather than from the child, for example, the inner child, but from the self, one understands that these two opposing forces can never be reconciled. And it is about holding these two things within the psyche, being able to bear not having to resolve them or not being able to resolve them. And by doing that, then, from an alchemical perspective, a third way is revealed. And it is not an easy process. We need to be grown-ups to do this. We need to start to understand that the genesis of everything is from inside out. We are not going to be able to look at somebody else to tell us what to do. And if we are looking at somebody else or something else to tell us what to do, then we are in some way absolving ourselves of responsibility over our lives. And temperance is about temperance in its highest form is about really claiming authority for our lives and understanding that the ego is now strong enough to be able to withstand not knowing, internal conflict, external conflict, and the fact that nothing is easily resolved, and sometimes two things are at total odds with each other, and yet there must be room in the psyche for both. So then you have temperance, and you can see it's quite a long journey up to the tower. I think it's important to do this. Once you've gone through this change and you've learnt to adult, by holding these opposing forces, then you are able to confront the devil being the shadow side all of us. And we have to have the tools to be able to confront the devil, because otherwise we can either push the devil away or we can identify too much. And the whole point is to understand that we all have a shadow side. Each of us has things that we have gone and put away somewhere that we don't want to have a look at. They may be in the attic, in other words, in those unexplored parts of our psyche. They may be in the cellar, in other words, in our past. But they are things that we haven't wanted to look at. But now we've had all of these experiences that have equipped us to be able to look at the devil. Not to embrace the devil, because that's to identify. It's best to approach the devil as the concept with a sense of humility. I think that's the word. It's being humble in the face of one's own shortcomings. The devil is not an easy card to contend with. It's definitely not the religious idea of the devil, but rather it's contending with those parts of us that we have never wanted to acknowledge, that are harbingers of shame, things that we are ashamed about, things that we dare not even admit to ourselves, let alone others. As the cards move from the very personal major arcana cards to the impersonal ones, there is this bit in the middle that is really that transition from child to adult, from the ignorance of the fool to the knowingness of the self. And it's interesting that I am recording this in between two eclipses, so that is that transition point as well. And then that takes us up to the tower. And the tower is then, after all of this journey of going through reflection and change and balance and the holding of opposites and the looking at the shadow, is the falling away of something or an aspect of oneself or a part of external life that no longer serves. It was built perhaps with very good intentions, and yet it now needs to be destroyed. So, for example, the Tower of Babel, that idea of wanting to build a tower up to God, are godlike aspirations of specialness, of the ego being something that leads the way, they are swept away in one fell swoop by the tower. And so God destroyed the Tower of Babel, and the inner God, the self, is a key player here in the way that I view things, as a protagonist in what is swept away in your life. Now, this is the foundation card, so this is something that has already happened. It might be that the ground is still shaking, there's dust in the air, there's something that has fallen away, but it has already done this, or it is in the process of doing it. It's not something that's coming up. So what I would do is I would suggest that you look for where the tower has appeared, either in the recent past or where the tower has appeared throughout your life. And maybe there is a linking theme to all of that. Where is it that you have this profound sense of change? And very often the tower will be absolutely beyond your control. In fact, probably more often than not. In fact, if you think that you can control the tower, then that's the ego's attempt to try and bring meaning or control back to something that to the ego feels meaningless, or where the ego feels helpless. And actually the self sees things differently. So it's about looking through the eyes of the self and being able to get the assistance to do that if you can't do it yourself. So the tower sweeps away. Something has changed. It may be connected with Mars. If you follow astrology, it is very Martian energy. It can feel violent. It can feel sudden. It is disruptive, whether you view it as so-called positive or negative. And I am going to read the writing on the card, which is destroying old things, spiritual renewal, self-knowledge. So destroying old things, it is the stuff that no longer serves. It's the things that we cling on to because we fear change, that's it really. There are various other ways of saying the same thing, but it is the things that we hold on to because we fear change. This is the breakup of relationships, of alliances. It is the crashing down of an area of life that on which you had built a lot of hopes, perhaps, or where you had expended a lot of energy. There is that idea of the sunken cost fallacy that's sort of come up for me now, just as I was speaking. The sunken cost fallacy is where we have devoted so much time and energy into something that really isn't working. We continue to devote the time and energy because, after all, we've put so much effort into it, we just can't afford to give it up now. And actually, the tower really doesn't give a shit about any of that, and it sweeps it all away. So the tower, it almost reconciles the sunken cost fallacy and just moves that out the way, and therefore there is this period of disruption. So imagine yourself now standing in the sort of building site of your life, and there will be something that has been detonated and brought down around you. It's not going to be everything. So the thing to do is not to fixate on the thing that's fallen, into its own footprint, or it may have sort of smashed into a couple of things on the way down. But to focus on what else is there, what it's left, and also the clearing that it might have left, something where you can start again with a greater sense of integrity. And you have access to that integrity because, as a result of the journey through the central part of the major arcana cards, you have an access to resources that are inside, rather than you having to rely on, focus on, depend on the resources outside. As soon as you are starting to do that, as soon as you start looking outside for your direction, for your sense of meaning, I'm not saying that you don't need that at all, but that shouldn't be the primary thing. If you're going along with this, with the way that I approach the cards, which is a very Jungian approach. As soon as you start doing that, as soon as you start looking outside, and keep that broad, there are many ways that we look outside and we think we're not, whether it's asking for advice, or whether it's particular practices that we do. Where is it that we're giving power away to others, to entities, to movements? Wherever it is, we have built our building, our castle, on sand rather than on rock, to go back to the parable. So the tower is really the prompting to rebuild on something more solid, something that has a foundation, and that foundation has its roots inside. You start there, and then there is integrity to what is built. And when there's integrity, when the storms come, when the sands shift, it doesn't move. It is stable, and it's solid, and it's a place that you can retreat to inside. You can withdraw in and know that that is going to be your safe foundation no matter what happens around you. So that is the foundation. Something has been cleared, and it is paving the way then for the current weather. So this is how the tower is going to then pave the way for the theme, and this is card number 2, which is the Seven of Swords. The Seven of Swords in this deck is particularly expressive, and it's interesting that there really is not much of a let-up between the Tower and the Seven of Swords, which is futility here. So it's almost as if the Tower is still reverberating. It's not as if... So the ground is still shaking and the dust is still clearing. It's not that the Tower's done and it's out the way. You're now dealing with the aftermath of this Tower falling down. And what you have to contend with here is, as that tiny figure... there is this beast of something. Now, I often view this as the beast of institutionalization. It's the beast of the collective, of crowds, of groupthink, of all of those kinds of things. And the reason why I often think this is because I always look at the monster, and it looks like it's made up of neckties, particularly down through what I guess would stand in for its nose. It is to do with conforming, being part of a sort of amorphous group of people. It's corporatization, but I mean, I'm not saying anti-corporate or anything like that, but rather the idea where everyone has their role, responsibility, and the individual is kind of blended out in favor of this conglomeration of people that then just becomes a thing in and of itself. The individual is lost, and then as a result, this monster, this head, is there, and that is what happens when individuality is lost. Is that you either join it or you choose to step away. Now, when I look at this small figure, to me, it always says that there is absolutely no point in trying to go head to head with this creature. There is no point whatsoever. The only thing that you can do is, you can go head to head if you want. You will lose. I am fairly certain of that. Those jaws are beckoning, and there is a lot of space for it, for a small person to fit into. So you can either try and fight it, or you can join it, or you can choose the self and step away from it. It's not really a confrontation that you can win by engaging head to head with it. There's the idea of futility. It is futile to try and do that. So, for example, one of the things that we learnt in psychology when I was at university is the power of the crowd. And the crowd itself becomes an entity. It is not about the individuals. The crowd itself has an identity and it has a personality. And Jung talks about this as well. And it's a book that's worth reading. It's very short. It's the last book that he wrote, called The Undiscovered Self. And it was written in the late 50s. And it is really about understanding the power of crowds, the collective insanity of crowds, and then the individual's drive to separate off from crowds and to individuate, to become oneself. One cannot fight the crowd. The crowd is very powerful. So going back to the psychology side of things, they can be incredibly destructive. They can be passively destructive as well. They can be constructive as well, but if you are wanting to follow your own true path, then it cannot be in a crowd all the time. And so therefore, the Seven of Swords is really about facing up to the futility of identifying with a group. Now, I say a crowd, it can be a massive crowd. It doesn't necessarily have to be a crowd that's physically present. It can be a movement, it can be a political party, it could be the company that you're involved in, where you work, it could be your family of birth, it could be your current family. Whatever way it is a group that explicitly or implicitly asks you to conform. And there is a place here where you now know, because of the Tower, that you can no longer do that. You can no longer go along with the crowd in a particular way. It is about understanding the futility of your situation and stepping away if you want. Otherwise, you can jump into the mouth of the beast and then you become part of it. But I wouldn't necessarily suggest that, simply because the card doesn't really particularly depict that as an option that is worth considering. So written on the card is existential angst. And then I'm looking at the rest in the accompanying book, because the rest of the card is pretty much all German. And this is what Karl Röhrig and his wife, who wrote the book, suggested as the interpretation from the Röhrig perspective. Discouragement and futility, imagined obstacles, but at the same time the chance to emerge from the difficulties with greater maturity. So that falls very much in line with that idea of where the Tower brings us into that idea of greater maturity. But also it's interesting with the imagined obstacles. So what stood out for me in terms of imagined obstacles is you are looking in the wrong direction. So if you're looking at something and it seems insurmountable, look somewhere else. I think that is the suggestion. Instead of looking into the mouth of the beast, like this figure is with his briefcase, it is looking elsewhere, looking down, looking off to his right rather than to his left. And as you can see, there is a little halo of light around his head. That is the connection into the self. That is one's own divinity. It is connection to the God within. And having dealt with the devil before the tower, and then having dealt with the tower, you know exactly what you're looking at. You may not be able to go into specifically the detail, but you know what it's going to do, and you don't need to do it. I think that this is a very instructive reading. I'm feeling quite instructive about this. It could be the Martian energy from the tower, but it's you do not have to fight City Hall. You do not have to jump into the mouth of the beast. You do not have to identify with the crowd. And again, it's difficult not identifying with the crowd. It is a challenge. That's why you have been through all of those cards in the majors. It takes being an adult and being able to stand on your own 2 feet to not go along with consensus opinion. Because one of the things that we tend to say to ourselves is, well, it must be right if so many people believe it. I seem to be the lone voice in the wilderness that's saying something else, so I'm probably wrong. And you know what? You may not be wrong. In fact, you're probably not. If you're connected in with yourself, it will be an authentic voice, but it also might be the only voice. But it's your voice, and it's your inner voice, and it's worth listening to. Don't be cowed by the crowds. The crowds are very convincing. They're very loud. They can be incredibly destructive, and they can be quite threatening. That's why it's not a good idea to, start as that figure in the card swinging your briefcase at this monster. You don't have to do that. Don't kick the hornet's nest. It's about finding a different perspective, looking away from that obstacle, shifting away, getting out of there. And getting out of there may be physical. It may actually be an exit out of something, or it may be getting out of there in terms of your mind and your thought patterns and your belief systems, and where it is that you have been held hostage by a certain sense of obligation and duty that really is in some way very disruptive and destructive, and about then finding that freedom that the self is guiding you towards. And as ever, this sounds simple. It's not easy. It's definitely not being suggested that it's easy by the cards, but it is being suggested that this is really the way out of this, is to understand the futility of facing a certain way and looking at what it is that you have been trying to deal with, and then understanding that perhaps actually you simply need to change direction, whether that is practically or whether it is internally. And again, this is fitting because this is the eclipse season. This is about change. There is a lot of change going on. There is the presence quite strongly of Uranus in astrology, which is really the unexpected happening, big changes, and the idea of being able to roll with the changes in a creative way. And you roll with the changes by connecting inside rather than listening to what other people tell you that you should be doing. So that is the foundation and then the weather for this month. And I'm now going to draw the final card, which is the agency card. And this is one place where you can connect in meaningfully. It may not be that you have control over external circumstances, but you will be able to in some way have control inside of how you respond to external circumstances. And that is the Wheel of Fortune. This is really interesting. So we have 2 major arcana cards on the outside and then a minor arcana in the middle. And the Wheel of Fortune, it was funny because before I turned it over, I thought this card is also going to be talking about the near future. It's not just going to be about the agency card. It's about something that is going to happen. And that makes sense because the Wheel of Fortune, very much like the Tower, is not really something you can control. So what it is essentially saying is that as a result of all of this, there is going to be change in some part of your life. Again, you don't necessarily need to look for the bells and whistles, the one that comes in with, choirs singing and big neon lights saying, here, look at this. But rather the change may be subtle, but but then have really quite big repercussions later down the line, where it changes the direction of your life. I mean, if you think about it, if you are walking in a straight line and you just do a 2-degree turn to the right, several miles down the road, you'll be in a completely different place from where you were when you did that 2-degree change. But back then it felt like nothing. And then suddenly it feels like something very different. You'll be seeing a whole different landscape in front of you. So the Wheel of Fortune, I think, is very much like the other cards, is about surrendering to the idea that things are going to change. The Wheel of Fortune is Jupiter, it's expansion. It is about putting a magnifying glass over something in a way. Jupiter makes things happen because it is so... because it is on such a large scale, and it's one of the impersonal outer planets. It's also, as far as I can remember, the planet that protects the Earth from meteors. It's one of the ones that kind of deflects a lot of the stuff that hurtles towards us on Earth. And so therefore there is a beneficence about it. There is a sense of protection around it. And one of the things that the Wheel of Fortune talks about, if you look at that, the wheel around, is, and now it's interesting as well. I will go back to what it talks about, but this needs to come first. The monster, the sort of necktied monster of the crowd, has become sort of very small, I think, in that sort of slightly military figure at the bottom. He's been dwarfed by the fact that the cosmos has other bigger things in store. He's kind of been revealed for who he is, and I always think of him as sort of being a bit officious, being a bit, because he's in uniform. It's almost as if he's chivying people along to conform, to stand in line, to obey. And actually, so Jupiter, next to Jupiter, it's really dwarfed. That monster suddenly becomes a sort of smaller figure next to the changes of the cosmos. And so going back to the Wheel of Fortune, what it suggests is, like any kind of wheel, if you imagine being on a wheel, the most disruption is going to be on the outside when it moves. You get much more movement. Whereas if you stay in the center, you get less movement. You are the still point when everything else around is changing. So you know about movement, you know about things shaking around, you know about disruption. This is the Tower that has taught you this. And the Wheel of Fortune then, when change happens, and it will be inevitable, whether it's on a large scale or a small scale, and as I said, the small scale may have significant impacts further down the line. When that happens, go into your center. Take some time to center yourself. You may have to do something practical, meditation, exercise, grounding yourself into the earth around you, but also to understand perhaps that this kind of disruption or movement, and it may be welcome, by the way, it doesn't mean that it's any less disruptive. It's not that it's going to be bad news. In fact, Jupiter normally suggests that the change is here for the highest good, that it can often be an incredibly positive experience, but it can still feel disruptive, particularly to the ego. The ego is that outer shell that we have. There's the outer side of the wheel. The ego doesn't like that movement. It just wants things to stay exactly the same. And bless it, it does as much as it can to try and keep it from changing. But that wheel is cosmic. It moves. It doesn't. There is absolutely no thought of what it's going to do to the ego. The ego doesn't get a look in with this. So what it is about then is withdrawing into the self. Withdrawing from the ego, the outer wheel, to the self, which is the center of the wheel. And then being able to work with that. So the other tool is to understand it, to know that when the change happens, that it is going to feel disruptive, that you are going to feel discombobulated at times, that there is no avoiding that. There is no nice way through this that promises calm seas. It's not that. Rather, it's about going through this, battening down the hatches, and finding that place inside you that knows that this will pass. And again, it may be a joyous experience, by the way, but then you can also get disrupted by a lot of positive emotion. That can also be very ungrounding. So watch yourself whether you go off into some kind of like mild mania, because that can also, Jupiter puts a magnifying glass over everything. So it's a good idea to try and find that adult within who is able to say, right, it doesn't matter whether this is so-called positive or negative, but what matters is a sense of holding to oneself and an integrity within and to oneself. And then that movement is less disruptive. You are able to, in some way, from the perspective of the self, bear witness rather than feel like you're getting, that you are getting not thrown around, but things are shifting and they are not particularly comfortable. So it is about being the observer, not about detaching from something, and not about dissociation. Those are two different things, and I would say that both of those lie on the outside of the wheel, or you've left the wheel entirely, but rather about being with it, but with the emphasis on being rather than doing. There is no controlling the wheel. So then go off and if you are to do anything, rather do something else. Do something that brings you back to yourself. And so that's really the lesson for this, is that you've got the tower that's fallen, that's led the way to understanding that a confrontation with something, and it could be internal or external, is futile, and that in order to live your life with more integrity and to find the direction that you are really due to walk on, the one that is really the true path of the self, you need to step away from what it is that you're confronting, knowing that you will never win if you take it on directly, and that actually there is something else that is beckoning in a different direction. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you then institute dramatic change in your life, but rather to be able to understand that direction could simply even be a state of how you view things, of what it is that you choose to focus on inwardly. It doesn't have to be a big change outwardly. And as a result of that, then it is about seeking out that calm center as that wheel turns, as Jupiter works its magic, as Jupiter comes into effect, and then things change. So yes, the agency card is about staying with the center, but also the third card this time is about what's coming up. And it's significant because you've got two soul cards. You've got two soul cards here. You've got the Seven of Swords, which is really a card of inner conflict and of being able to conserve what is for you and then get rid of the rest. And then that will lead you into whatever it is that change brings you. But one way or the other, the change is inevitable. These two cards, the majors, are archetypal. They are archetypal forces. The ego has no control over this, but the self is connected in with the archetypal. The self knows the language of the archetypal. So this is about the journey into the center, away from the beast and towards oneself. Any questions, any comments, anything like that, as ever, you can send them my way, sarah@integratedtarot.com. Otherwise, I will leave it at that and wish for you a cool, calm and collected center in the midst of whatever it is that is changing in your world. And speak to you next month. Bye. Thank you.